Negligence becomes emergency when the woman suffering in a hospital corridor is the estranged sister of the man who owns the entire facility. Eugene Kwon learned that lesson in the emergency department of Mercy General Hospital in Miami, when he arrived for routine facility inspection and found his sister Shakira Moore, whom he hadn't spoken to in 8 years, sitting in a wheelchair in obvious labor, having been waiting for care for 3 hours while nurses prioritized other patients, unaware that the visibly distressed black woman they were ignoring was family to the Korean-American physician who'd bought the hospital 2 years earlier and who was about to transform their negligence into the most comprehensive patient care review in the facility's history. The story started 8 years earlier, when Eugene and Shakira's relationship had fractured over decisions about their mother's end-of-life care. They were half-siblings. Eugene was 42 now, had a Korean mother and African-American father. Shakira was 38, had the same father but a different mother who was also African-American. They'd grown up in the same household after their father's second marriage ended, and Shakira had come to live with him full-time when she was 12. Despite the blended family complexity, they'd been close through childhood and young adulthood. Eugene had gone to medical school, specialized in hospital administration, eventually became successful healthcare executive. Shakira had pursued social work, focused on supporting low-income families, worked for nonprofit organizations. Their relationship had been strong until their father developed terminal cancer. The disagreements about his care had been profound and painful. Eugene had wanted aggressive treatment that might extend their father's life even if the quality of that extended time was poor. Shakira had wanted palliative care focused on comfort rather than on extending life that would be spent suffering. The conflict had escalated during their father's final months. They'd fought about every decision, treatment options, pain management approaches, whether to continue interventions that were causing distress without providing meaningful benefit. Their father had ultimately sided with Shakira's palliative approach, had died peacefully with hospice care rather than in hospital with aggressive interventions. But the damage to the siblings' relationship had been complete. At the funeral, they'd had final confrontation that ended their contact. "Dad died the way he wanted," Shakira had said. "Comfortable, at home, surrounded by family. That matters more than the extra few weeks aggressive treatment might have bought." "You gave up on him," Eugene had responded. "You prioritized your philosophy about death with dignity over fighting for every possible moment of his life. I'll never forgive you for persuading him to stop treatment. He made his own choice. You just can't accept that his choice wasn't the one you wanted him to make. Your influence shaped that choice. You were supposed to support him, not convince him to give up. I did support him. I supported his right to die without suffering through treatments that were making him miserable without actually curing him. You wanted to control his death the way you tried to control everything else." That had been their last conversation. 8 years of silence followed. No contact, no attempts at reconciliation, complete estrangement despite being the only surviving members of their immediate family. During those 8 years, Eugene had continued building his career in healthcare administration. He'd been CEO of several hospitals, had eventually acquired ownership stake in Mercy General Hospital in Miami through healthcare investment group he'd formed. He was now majority owner and chief executive officer of the facility. Shakira had continued her social work career in Miami, had married, had gotten divorced, was now pregnant with her first child at age 38. The pregnancy had been difficult: gestational diabetes, high blood pressure, concerns about preterm labor that had required careful monitoring. She was due in 3 weeks but had been experiencing concerning symptoms: regular contractions, lower back pain, fluid discharge that suggested her water might have broken. She'd called her obstetrician, been told to go to the hospital immediately for evaluation. She'd driven herself to the nearest emergency department, which happened to be Mercy General Hospital. She had no idea her estranged brother owned the facility. She'd been focused on getting medical care, not on researching hospital ownership. She'd arrived at the emergency department at 3 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon. The waiting room was crowded: flu season, multiple accident victims from a highway pileup, the usual chaos of urban emergency medicine. She'd checked in with the intake nurse, explained her symptoms: 37 weeks pregnant, regular contractions every 5 minutes, possible rupture of membranes, history of complicated pregnancy with gestational diabetes. The intake nurse had taken basic information, told her to wait in the general waiting area, said someone would call her back for triage assessment. Shakira had waited. And waited. She'd watched as other patients were called back. People who'd arrived after her, people whose conditions seemed less urgent than active labor. After an hour, she'd approached the desk to ask about the delay. "I'm in labor. I've been having contractions every 5 minutes. I really need to be evaluated. We're aware of your symptoms, ma'am. We're experiencing high patient volume. You'll be called back as soon as we have availability. I'm 37 weeks pregnant. Active labor isn't something that can wait for hours. The triage nurse will assess your urgency when you're called back. Please return to the waiting area." Shakira had returned to the waiting area, increasingly uncomfortable and increasingly concerned about why she wasn't being prioritized despite obvious obstetric emergency. After 2 hours, her contractions were intensifying. She approached the desk again. "I need to be seen immediately. My contractions are 3 minutes apart now. This is active labor." "Ma'am, we understand you're uncomfortable. But we have multiple critical patients ahead of you. You'll be called back as soon as possible." "What critical patients?" "I've watched people with minor injuries and non-urgent conditions be taken back before me. Why am I being deprioritized? The triage process is based on medical assessment of urgency. Please be patient." After 3 hours, Shakira was in significant pain, was having contractions every 2 minutes, was starting to feel pressure that suggested the baby was descending. She knew enough about childbirth to recognize that she was progressing rapidly and that she needed medical intervention immediately. She approached the desk for a third time, this time unable to stand through the full conversation due to contraction. "I'm about to give birth in your waiting room if someone doesn't help me right now. I need a labor and delivery nurse immediately." The desk nurse looked annoyed rather than concerned. "Ma'am, we don't have labor and delivery nurses in the emergency department. If you're actually in active labor, we'll transfer you to obstetrics once we've completed triage. But you need to stop disrupting the waiting area and let us do our jobs." Another patient, an older white woman who'd been waiting for over an hour with what appeared to be a sprained ankle, spoke up. "She's clearly in labor. Why isn't anyone helping her? She was here before me and she's obviously in more urgent need of care." The desk nurse's response was revealing. "We're handling the situation appropriately. Please don't interfere with our triage process." Shakira recognized what was happening. She was being deprioritized because she was a black woman in obvious distress in a waiting room full of patients with various racial backgrounds. The implicit bias was clear. Her pain wasn't being taken as seriously, her urgency wasn't being recognized, her repeated requests for care were being dismissed as overreaction rather than as legitimate medical emergency. She'd experienced this bias throughout her pregnancy: doctors who didn't take her pain seriously, nurses who assumed she was exaggerating symptoms, medical professionals who treated her concerns as inconvenient rather than as important clinical information. But this was different. This was active labor being ignored in an emergency department specifically because of how her race and presentation were being perceived by staff who were making biased assessments about whose discomfort deserved immediate response. At 6 p.m., 3 hours after her arrival, Shakira felt another contraction that was different from the others. This one was accompanied by overwhelming pressure and an urgent need to push. She knew she was about to give birth. Not in hours, in minutes. She stood from her wheelchair, approached the desk one final time, her voice strained with pain and fury. "I am giving birth right now. Either you get me to labor and delivery in the next 5 minutes or I'm delivering this baby in your waiting room and then I'm suing this hospital for negligence and racial discrimination. Those are your options." The desk nurse finally seemed to recognize the severity of the situation. "Let me get a wheelchair and we'll take you to obstetrics." "I'm already in a wheelchair. I've been in this wheelchair for 3 hours while you've ignored my repeated requests for care. Get me to labor and delivery now or I'm calling 911 and having another ambulance take me to a different hospital." That's when Eugene walked into the emergency department. He was conducting one of his routine facility inspections, unannounced walkthroughs where he observed operations, talked to staff, identified areas needing improvement. He made a point of doing these inspections regularly to maintain direct contact with how the hospital actually functioned rather than just reviewing reports and metrics. He entered through the emergency department entrance, was immediately struck by how crowded and chaotic the waiting area was. He made mental note to review staffing levels and triage protocols. Then he saw Shakira. She was standing at the desk, clearly in labor, clearly in distress, arguing with a nurse who seemed more annoyed than concerned. The scene was troubling on multiple levels: the apparent neglect of a patient in obvious medical emergency, the dismissive attitude of the staff, the visible suffering of someone who should have been receiving immediate obstetric care. He walked closer, intending to intervene as hospital administrator to address what appeared to be problematic patient care. Then he recognized her. Despite 8 years of estrangement, despite the changes time and pregnancy had brought, he knew his sister immediately. Shakira? She turned toward his voice, saw him, and her expression shifted through shock, recognition, and something like desperate relief. June. I'm in labor. I've been here for 3 hours and no one will help me. Everything else became secondary to that statement. His estranged sister, in active labor, being neglected in his hospital. He turned to the desk nurse with controlled fury that made her step back. This woman has been in your waiting room for 3 hours in active labor and you haven't transferred her to obstetrics? Sir, we have high patient volume and we're triaging based on urgency. She's in active labor. She's 37 weeks pregnant. That's the definition of urgent. Why hasn't she been taken to labor and delivery immediately? We were assessing her symptoms to determine. You've had 3 hours to assess her symptoms. She's my sister and she's about to give birth in your emergency department because you've failed to provide appropriate care. Get her to labor and delivery right now or you're terminated. The transformation in the staff's response was instant and comprehensive. Suddenly multiple nurses appeared. Suddenly there was a wheelchair and an escort to obstetrics. Suddenly everyone was apologizing and moving with the urgency that should have been present 3 hours earlier. June accompanied Shakira as they rushed her to labor and delivery, holding her hand through contractions, apologizing for the neglect she'd experienced, coordinating with the obstetric team to ensure she received immediate care. I can't believe you own this hospital, Shakira said between contractions. I didn't know. I just came here because it was closest. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry you were treated this way. This should never happen to anyone but especially not to you. Why does it matter that I'm your sister? Would the care only be appropriate because of who I'm related to? No. The care should have been appropriate because you're a patient in active labor. But yes, the fact that you're my sister makes the negligence personal in ways that will drive systematic change to ensure it never happens to anyone else. They reached labor and delivery. The obstetric team took over, conducted rapid assessment that confirmed what Shakira had been trying to tell the emergency department nurses for 3 hours. She was fully dilated, the baby was crowning, she was minutes away from delivery. 45 minutes after finally receiving care, Shakira gave birth to a healthy baby girl. June stayed throughout the delivery, holding his sister's hand, meeting his niece for the first time, experiencing a complicated mix of joy about the birth and fury about the neglect that had preceded it. After the delivery, once Shakira and the baby were stable, June left to address what had happened in the emergency department. He called an immediate meeting with emergency department leadership, patient safety officers, and hospital counsel. I need a comprehensive review of what happened today. A woman in active labor sat in our emergency department for 3 hours without receiving appropriate care. I need to know why the triage system failed, why multiple requests for care were ignored, and what systemic problems allowed this negligence to occur. The emergency department medical director tried to explain. We had high patient volume. The triage nurse assessed the patient's symptoms and made determination that other patients had more urgent needs. Stop. A woman in active labor at 37 weeks does not have lower priority than sprained ankles and flu symptoms. Either your triage nurse is incompetent or there was bias affecting the assessment. Which is it? I don't think we can assume bias. I watched the interaction. I saw how the nurses responded to my sister's requests for care versus how they responded once they knew who she was. The change was immediate and dramatic. That's evidence of bias in how her urgency was being assessed prior to my arrival. What do you want us to do? I want comprehensive review of all triage decisions made today. I want interviews with every staff member who interacted with my sister. I want assessment of whether other patients have experienced similar delays in care and whether there are patterns based on race, language, or other demographic factors. And I want immediate implementation of obstetric emergency protocols that ensure anyone presenting in active labor receives immediate transfer to labor and delivery regardless of general emergency department volume. The review took 2 weeks. What it revealed was worse than Eugene had anticipated. The triage system had significant bias problems. Black patients, Hispanic patients, and patients with limited English proficiency were systematically experiencing longer wait times than white patients with comparable conditions. Pain reports from minority patients were being taken less seriously than identical pain reports from white patients. Obstetric emergencies affecting minority women were being deprioritized in favor of minor injuries and non-urgent conditions affecting white patients. The patterns were clear in the data once someone actually looked for them. But no one had been looking because the people experiencing the bias were exactly the people whose complaints were being dismissed as exaggeration or as attempts to skip ahead in line. This is systemic discrimination, Eugene said during the presentation of findings. We've been providing inferior care to minority patients for years. My sister's experience wasn't an isolated incident. It was a typical pattern that we failed to identify because we weren't examining our own biases. What are you recommending? Complete restructuring of triage protocols with mandatory bias training for all emergency department staff. Implementation of standardized pain assessment tools that don't rely on subjective judgment about patient credibility. Creation of patient advocate positions for non-English speaking patients and for patients who report experiencing discrimination. Monthly audits of wait times and treatment patterns by demographic categories to identify emerging bias problems before they become systematic. And termination of any staff member who can't or won't adapt to bias-aware care protocols. The changes were implemented over 6 months. Staff who resisted were reassigned or terminated. New protocols were established. Oversight mechanisms were created. The hospital's patient satisfaction scores improved significantly, particularly among minority patients who'd previously experienced the longest delays and the most dismissive treatment. During this transformation, Eugene was also rebuilding his relationship with Shakira. He visited her and his new niece, named Joy, several times a week. They talked about the 8 years of estrangement, about the unresolved pain from their father's death, about whether they could build new relationship despite that history. I'm sorry, Eugene said during one of these visits. For how I behaved after Dad died. For blaming you for his choices. For allowing my need to control the situation to destroy our relationship. I'm sorry too. For being so certain I was right that I didn't acknowledge your grief and your need to feel like you were doing everything possible to save him. Can we move past it? I don't want to lose another 8 years. I think we can. But it requires both of us accepting that we failed each other during the hardest time in our lives, and that the negligence I experienced in your hospital was partly consequence of the systemic problems you hadn't addressed because you weren't looking for them. What do you mean? You own a hospital that was systematically providing inferior care to people who look like me. That happened under your leadership even though you didn't intend it. The same way our conflict over Dad's care happened partially because you were so focused on medical interventions that you couldn't hear what he was actually saying about what he wanted. Both situations reveal pattern where your focus on what you think is right makes you blind to evidence that challenges your assumptions. Eugene sat with that criticism for a long moment. You're right. I've spent my career believing that technical competence and good intentions were sufficient for good outcomes. Your experience proved that systematic bias can exist even when leadership has good intentions, and that technical competence doesn't prevent harm when you're not examining your own assumptions about whose suffering deserves immediate response. Can you actually change that pattern or just acknowledge it? I'm trying to change it. The hospital reforms are part of that. This conversation is part of that. Being part of Joy's life is part of that. I can't undo the 8 years we lost or the 3 hours you spent suffering in my emergency department. But I can build different present and future that doesn't repeat those failures. Over the next 3 years, Yoo-jun and Shakira rebuilt their relationship gradually and carefully. He was present in Joy's life, attended her birthdays and important events, developed close relationship with his niece. He also became advocate for healthcare equity, speaking publicly about how his sister's experience had revealed systemic problems in his own facility and using his platform as hospital owner to promote bias awareness in medical settings. Shakira returned to her social work career, focusing specifically on healthcare advocacy for low-income patients and minority communities. She used her own experience to inform her work, helping other patients navigate systems that might otherwise ignore or deprioritize their needs. Mercy General Hospital became recognized leader in healthcare equity, implementing programs and protocols that other facilities studied and replicated. 3 years after the day she'd been ignored in the emergency department, Shakira was invited to speak at a healthcare equity conference about her experience. I sat in a hospital waiting room for 3 hours while in active labor because the nurses looking at me saw a black woman in distress and didn't perceive my pain as urgent enough to interrupt their workflow. That's not unique experience, it's typical pattern that contributes to why black mothers in America die at 3 times the rate of white mothers during childbirth. What was unique about my experience was that my estranged brother happened to own the hospital and happened to arrive during the final moments of my neglect. His intervention ensured I received care before giving birth in the waiting room. But his intervention also revealed that the systemic problems weren't isolated to my case, they were patterns affecting every patient who didn't fit the profile of whose pain the staff had been trained to take seriously. The reforms that followed weren't just about preventing another incident like mine. They were about examining how bias operates in medical settings even when healthcare providers have good intentions and technical competence. They were about creating accountability systems that identify discrimination before it becomes crisis. I'm grateful for the relationship I've rebuilt with my brother. But I'm more grateful for the thousands of patients who will receive better care because my neglect was witnessed by someone with power to force systematic change. Healthcare equity requires both individual advocacy in moments of crisis and structural reform that prevents those crises from happening to the next patient who doesn't have family connections to hospital ownership. Yoo-jun was in the audience for that speech. Afterward, he reflected on how profoundly that day had changed both his understanding of healthcare and his relationship with his sister. Shakira's neglect revealed my failures as both a brother and as a hospital administrator. I'd spent 8 years estranged from family because I couldn't accept that my approach to our father's care might not have been the only right approach. I'd spent years running a hospital without examining whether our care protocols were affected by bias because I assumed good intentions were sufficient. Both failures came from the same source, belief that my perspective was objective and that evidence challenging my assumptions could be dismissed. Shakira's experience forced me to examine those assumptions about both family relationships and about healthcare delivery. The most important lesson was that neglect isn't always intentional. The nurses who ignored my sister didn't consciously decide that black women's pain matters less. But their training, their experiences, and systemic bias in healthcare meant that when they looked at her, they didn't perceive her distress as requiring immediate response the way they would have if she'd been white. Addressing that bias required more than just disciplining the staff involved. It required examining every protocol, every training program, every assumption about whose complaints deserved immediate attention versus whose could wait. That's ongoing work that will continue for years. But it's work that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't walked into my emergency department on the day my estranged sister was being neglected. Family connection created the crisis that forced systematic change. That's privilege I can't ignore. My sister received care because of who she was related to, but that same care should be available to every patient regardless of whether they have family connections to hospital ownership. 5 years after Joy's birth, the siblings had built stable, close relationship that acknowledged their past conflicts while focusing on their present connection. Joy knew her uncle Yoo-jun as constant presence in her life, someone who attended her school events and birthday parties, who'd taught her about her grandfather she'd never met, who'd explained in age-appropriate terms how her birth had changed his hospital's approach to patient care. Mercy General Hospital maintained its commitment to healthcare equity, continuing the reforms that had started with Shakira's experience and expanding them to address other areas where bias affected patient outcomes. The emergency department where Shakira had been ignored was now training site for bias awareness in medical settings, with her experience used as case study in how systematic discrimination operates even when individual providers have good intentions. 10 years after their estrangement began and 5 years after it ended, Eugene and Shakira reflected on what they'd lost and what they'd rebuilt. "We lost 8 years because I was too rigid to accept that Dad's choices were valid even when they weren't the choices I would have made," Eugene said. "We rebuilt our relationship because your neglect in my hospital forced me to examine my assumptions about everything from patient care to family relationships. We lost 8 years because we were both too hurt and too certain we were right to reach out," Shakira added. "We rebuilt because circumstance forced us into contact that neither of us would have initiated voluntarily." That's not exactly heartwarming reconciliation story. No, but it's honest one. We didn't rebuild because we'd matured past our conflict. We rebuilt because your medical emergency happened in my facility and I couldn't ignore you anymore. Everything after that. The hospital reforms, the relationship with Joy, the work we've both done on healthcare equity, flowed from that forced contact. Do you think we would have eventually reconciled without that day? I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe we would have spent the rest of our lives estranged because neither of us could get past our pride and our certainty that we'd been right about Dad's care. What matters is that we did reconcile. And that your hospital changed in ways that will affect thousands of patients who will never know my name or my story but who will receive better care because my neglect was witnessed and addressed. They'd proven that negligence becomes emergency when you discover the person suffering is family, that blood connections can create accountability that policy and good intentions fail to generate, that systemic change often requires crisis that makes invisible problems impossible to ignore, and that reconciliation after years of estrangement can come from the most unexpected circumstances. Like giving birth in a hospital waiting room while your estranged brother who owns the facility witnesses your neglect and transforms fury into comprehensive reform.